Good. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Welcome back to another session of our Friday talk. The topic today is religion and culture. This topic, its importance is, there's a lot of misunderstanding about our religion that come through cultural issues, especially from the West, the way they understand. And these two things are so closely interrelated. I think it is worth to spend an hour to talk about it. So this is the agenda. I've divided this into 5 subtopics. We'll start with looking into interaction of culture and religion, but we will need to make a very simple definition just to revisit. I mean, everybody understand what is culture, what is religion. And then we'll talk about the role of culture in Islam, and we'll try to explain the cultural diversity that we see in global Muslim societies. We'll talk about good and bad cultures, and if we have time, we will touch the cultural challenges facing Muslims living in the West. So what is culture? In a nutshell, we can say culture is a social identity of a society. And it consists of all these collective habits and customs and traditions that members of the society, they share. Culture is expressed through various elements, so including language, food, clothing, arts, customs, traditions, architecture, literature, and there are many, many more. So when you see people, sometimes you could identify them, who they are, just by looking, the external facade. And therefore, culture is essentially what shape the behavior of individuals, and good or bad. So culture is not always good. Sometimes we may have bad culture within a society, and that is how it contributes to society's identity. So that's, in a nutshell, what is culture. The one short term that you can take with you is social identity. Is a social identity of a society. Now, on the other hand, when we talk about religion, especially in the context of Islam, because religion in general, it is understood as a set of beliefs and practices. But in Islamic context, religion is a complete way of life. And therefore, for a Muslim, religion, it includes, all the set of beliefs, the practices. We have Sharia, so we have a law, the moral values and ethics, akhlaqiyat. And this is all meant how, they dictate how a Muslim must live his or her life. But Islam does not only dictate matters of personal devotions related to this faith and practice. It also dictates social, economic, and political aspect of life. And therefore, Islam is a religion, but also Islam is a worldview, and Islam is a civilization. And therefore, it influences every aspect of Muslim life and societal norms. So when you look at this more like an open-ended definition of religion of Islam, it encompasses, lot of cultural element. Therefore, it is important to understand how religion is related to culture. So first of all, religion, it finds its expression within the cultural settings and the context it inhabits. So for example, when Islam first arrived in Arabia in the 7th century, you will assume the Arabs had their own pre-Islamic culture. And Islam was not therefore revealed and propagated in a vacuum. People, they already had their culture. This means that while Islam, it has its universal teachings, its expression is influenced by the cultures in which it is propagated and practiced. On the other hand, culture is often shaped by the religious beliefs that it dominates. So in Islamic society, for example, cultural norms, values, ethics, and practices often drawn from the religious teachings, from the Islamic teachings. So the culture draws values, ethics, from religion. And therefore, now you see religion and the culture, they are kind of interrelated. They're kind of shaping each other. So the question is there a society without a culture? Is there a religious-free culture? And is there a culture-free religion? All right. The first question, there's no society, there's no known society without a culture. Because we already said culture encompasses these elements such as language, food, arts, customs, and therefore, at the minimum, a society must have at least a language, and food and basic customs. So every society, no matter how it is isolated or how small it is, it must develop a set of practices and norms that constitute its culture. And this is from the blueprint of how individuals are supposed to live in that society, how they're going to interact with each other and how they're going to interact with the environment. How about is there a religious-free culture? While there are culture today that are predominantly secular, or at least they claim to be secular, where religion does not openly influence, the public affairs or government, business. But no culture is completely free of religious influence. Let's take example, France. France practice a very extreme form of secularism. They call it laicite. And France, they go extra mile, to remove religious influence in the public space. However, their moral and their ethical values, many of their tradition, in fact, and even their public holidays within the French culture have been derived from and reflect its Judeo-Christian heritage. Therefore, you can't say, even if they claim, about this secularism, they cannot, totally, they cannot claim that, they are totally religious free. And therefore, there's no culture that is totally free from religious influence. How about, is there a culture-free religion? Also, no, there is no known religion without a culture, because religions or cultural influence, because religions inherently, they arise from and are practiced within cultural contexts. Okay, so which also shape how these religions are understood and how they are practiced and how they are celebrated and how people live, these religions. Therefore, even though many religions, if not all, they claim universality, that means theoretically they can be embraced and practiced by anyone. in any geography, but they're still understood, interpreted, and applied through cultural lens. Therefore, we can say that culture and religion are dynamically influencing each other. Culture shapes, both the expression and practice of religious beliefs, while religion influence, and form the cultural identity of a community or society. So this interaction is dynamic and is ongoing, contributing to the evolution of both cultural and religious practices over time. So I think this diagram summarizes, this point that I've just reflected on. So religion exists within already established culture, and Islam is a good example, yeah? And culture draws moral values and ethics from religion. So this is the relationship between the two. So let's look at the role of culture in Islam. Islam, unlike other religions, Islam recognizes and celebrates, cultural diversity, among people, and it's acknowledging the variety of customs, traditions, and cultural expressions found among people across different lands. And this is referenced in the Quran.
يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم إن الله عليم خبير.
So the term شعوبا وقبائل here really reflect this cultural diversity. But there is another verse that is even more explicit.
ومن آياته خلق السماوات والأرض واختلاف ألسنتكم وألوانكم إن في ذلك لآيات للعالمين.
Okay, so really Islam, it recognizes and it celebrates, the cultural diversity is, part of the design, of the divine design. But also Islam, it places limits on cultural practices as those that contradict Islamic teachings and principle, so such as the pre-Islamic culture of preference of male children, for example, or the practice of infanticide, of killing, baby girls. And this is obvious in the Quran.
وإذا بشر أحدهم بالأنثى ظل وجهه مسودا وهو كظيم.
Okay, so this idea of preferring male, I think it has not disappeared completely. It is still with us, and surprisingly, it is also shared in many other cultures as well. Other even non-Islamic cultures.
وإذا الموءودة سئلت بأي ذنب قتلت.
Okay, so what is the role of culture in Islam? So first of all, we already see that Islam, it recognizes cultural diversity. But how important is it? Now, if we look at the principles of urf or ada, which is a customary practices, in Sharia, it highlights how culture in Islam takes the weight of law.
خذ العفو وأمر بالعرف وأعرض عن الجاهلين.
So here, urf, we can say these are good cultures, customary practices that do not contradict with Islamic principles and teaching, but if they are established in a society, we are obliged, to comply. And for those people who are into Sharia and Ijtihad, urf is a source or a tool of Islamic law. So this makes Islam a flexible religion, because it adapts to these local conditions, and time as well, while maintaining its core tenets. It can encompass all these cultures, all right, as long as they are not contradicting to Islamic teachings. The arrival, for example, of Islam in the 7th century Arabia, it marked a very transformative period in the region's cultural and social dynamics, because here, although Islam, it did not replace, and it didn't aim to replace, entirely the pre-existing Arab culture, but sought to refine and to reform the practices that were contradictory or incongruent to its moral and ethical framework. And that's why this period was very, very interesting. So Islam kept and honored, the good cultures of Arabs at that time, but it also prohibited the bad cultures, as we have seen in those couple of verses. Also, it modified the problematic cultures. There are some cultures that they had some element that were not good, and therefore Islam modified those cultures and introduced some new beneficial cultures as well. So just to give you an example, we already talked about this prohibition of harmful practices. So Islam abolished the pre-Islamic practice of infanticide, particularly the killing of newborn girls, which stem from the socioeconomic motive. Yeah, Islam also prohibited the preference of male children over female by fathers. It emphasized the sanctity of human life and the equal value of both males and females. But we also see in the Quran reformation of marriage and divorce laws. So these were also not changed completely, but they were reformed. So Islam introduced many reforms to improve women's rights in marriage. Polygamy, for example, was regulated with the limits on the number of wives and conditions for fairness. Women's consent to marriage became mandatory. Marriage gift is required and belonging solely to the wife. Both men and women have been given right to initiate divorce, including women's rights to seek divorce in cases of mistreatment or neglect. So here we see reformation or modification of whatever that existing culture. And reformation of inheritance laws, for example. Before Islam, inheritance was restricted only to males who could bear arms and protect the tribe, and the women and children were excluded. So Islam introduced a comprehensive inheritance system that allocated shares for women, for children, and other relatives in all situations. So this system ensures more equitable distribution of wealth. It reflects justice and compassion, and it protects the rights of both genders, in the transfer of the wealth of the deceased. So these are examples of, some new cultures were introduced. And of course, in instances where the pre-Islamic customs and traditions did not contradict the core teachings and ethical principles of Islam, those were kept intact. All right, and this include, maybe some festivals, some style of dress, and many other things of food. So this approach demonstrated Islam's capacity for cultural adaptability and respect for diversity, as long as these did not impinge on new moral and ethical codes introduced by the religion. It's opposite to Christianity. Christianity and Judaism really they were aiming to create a monolithic society, as opposed to Islam aims to create a more diversified society. All right, so let's look at a little bit more on this cultural diversity in Islam. So the global Muslim population exhibit very significant cultural diversity. Sometimes if you look at a region, and if you look at it globally, but even if you look at within a country, for example, if we look at Oman, there are some some cultural variation. If you look at the people living in the north, or people living in the south, or people living in the center, you can see some variations, whether in clothing, whether in food, whether in some of the celebrations, so we have this diversity. So we're all Muslims, but when you look at Muslims in Oman, as opposed to Muslim in the neighboring countries, as opposed to Muslims in Pakistan, in India, as Muslim in Malaysia, in China, in Japan, all of this is a tapestry of very colorful cultural variations. So this diversity is evident in varieties of varied customs, tradition, languages, foods, arts, as seen across different Muslim communities. So in Islam, cultural diversity is not just tolerated, because this is what the Europeans are trying to do now. They want to, they talk about tolerating immigrants, because they come with a different culture, different faith, different, But in Islam, cultural diversity is not just tolerated. It's a reflection of the universal message of Islam, which is adapted to different cultural contexts. This is the key. All right. I like this quotation from this guy, Dr. Omar Farouk. Is a revert, but a fantastic scholar, Muslim scholar in the West, in America. And this is what he says. He says, throughout history, Islam has shown itself to be adaptable to different cultures. Like a clear river, its essence remains pure and life-giving, because water is colorless. So he equated Islam like a water that is flowing through a river. It remains pure and life-giving, but its hue, its color, its hue, reflect the local culture as it flows through various lands. So a river, the water, it could reflect on the bedrock over which it flows, but the water itself is pure. So in China, Islam appeared to be Chinese, and in Mali, it took on an African form. And this ability to remain culturally relevant across diverse regions and times has been key to Islam's success as a sort of a global civilization. So we can, we can see, this diversity, whether in clothing or in many other things as well. So Islam, so how do we get this cultural diversity in Islam? Because Islam allows each Muslim society to preserve its customs, its traditions, and its unique cultural expression, whether in terms of language or food or arts or folklores, clothing, celebration. Islam does not impinge on this. There's a sister who just raised hand. You can speak up, yes. Okay, maybe doesn't want to talk now. So Islam allows each Muslim society to preserve that. And this is how we got this diversity. Muslims are also allowed to absorb good culture of any society, and you make them like your own. As in this Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, quotation, it says, wisdom is the lost property of the believer. Wherever he finds it, he has a right to it. Now, I was trying to find the source of this quotation. I didn't find it in the, in the main Sahih collections, but I trace it from Imam al-Shafi'i Diwan. But I have heard this quotation many times, scholars, quoting. And here, wisdom, you can stretch it. Wisdom, cultural wisdom is part of wisdom. It's not just knowledge, knowledge in the sense of literal, literacy. Wisdom, it could be cultural wisdom. So it means that you can, you can adopt any good culture from any society and make it like your own, as long as the condition is it should not conflict with the Islamic teaching. And this approach of allowing cultural preservations in each society and also allowing adoption of any good culture that is not contradictory to Islam, you can say is the source of cultural diversity among Muslims. So you can think of Islam like a funnel, and you can put all these cultural elements into it, and Islam will retain those good culture, which are not contradictory to Islamic values, but it will get rid of all these, it will filter out all these, bad cultures. So, for example, a new Muslim comes to Islam, they may come with ideas that may be contradictory to Islam. And through learning, they will know, okay, this is good, this is, Islam accepts this, Islam does not accept this. For example, consumption of alcohol or smoking or all of this. Although some Muslim will practice these things, but they are not representing the Islamic teachings or Islamic values when they practice, these bad cultures. And we'll talk about it, inshallah. And there are factors they contribute to cultural diversity, and I know I've got here about 4 factors. So the first thing is this flexibility in cultural integration, which I have already touched, but also sometimes there's a development disparities between different Muslim countries, and it's kind of creating new cultures. For example, in a society where, in poor Muslim societies where women, let's say, don't have access to education, all right, and have not been given priority to education. It can develop a certain culture because that is different from others in places where women have access to education, like Oman, for example. So here, women, because they are not waiting to study, to graduate, to look for a job and all of that, most likely they will get married at a very early age, so they will start parenting children at a very early age. Maybe they will be more dependent, as opposed to in an area where women have access to education and they want to build career, they want to, study college or university, they want to do masters, bachelor, master, maybe PhDs and all of that. And therefore the issue of marriage, some they may be able to do both, and some they may have to compromise a little bit, maybe delay a little bit. So you do create all this diversity of culture. Cultural exchange among those living in close proximity. A good example I can give is in Indian subcontinent, where the Muslims and the Hindus, at least in the past, living very close to each other in harmony. Because today there's a lot of, with far-right government, there's a lot of, emphasis on friction between religions. But before, where they live in close proximity, sometimes, they kind of adopt each other's culture. And, some of the cultures are not even good cultures, yeah. So I have heard Muslims, when they want to marry their daughters, uh, they feel obligated to attract the boys by giving gifts, by giving, things, because in Hinduism, the dowry or mahar is a woman who gives, not men. In Islam, is the opposite. So these kind of things, they're going across cultures sometimes. And the other one is the historical journey of Islam, and attitude also differences among Muslims. And I can tell you a good example is Oman. For example, Oman, there's a much more tolerance of people of other religions, as well as within a Muslim, society, Muslim, you can say, madahib, both sectarian differences or doctrinal differences within different schools of jurisprudence. You may not see this in some other societies, yeah, where people, from all different schools, they live together peacefully. There's no tension. They pray together. They cross marriage and things like that. So Islam is practiced in a sort of more tolerance and peaceful coexistence. Maybe another good example is Turkish. Their history with the Ottomans, because Ottomans also, they were very tolerant, although they rule large geography consisting of very diversified cultures, but they were able to maintain tolerance and peaceful coexistence. So these are the kind of factors that contribute. So Islam, as I said, the easy adaptability to local customs has enabled it to embrace and enhance local customs that do not contradict its fundamental teachings. All right. So Islamic principles have been harmoniously woven into the fabric of various Southeast Asian countries, African and European cultures as well. All right. Islam was in Spain for 800 years in southern Italy, all these places, yeah? So this flexibility has resulted in a very colorful mosaic of cultural practices worldwide, right? So as I said, the development disparity, sometimes it can create all this, diversity as well. There's a significant variation in the level of economic and social development among Muslim majority countries, and these disparities influence how Islamic principles are prioritized and practiced. So factors such as availability of natural resources, access to education, which I just gave you an example of that, infrastructure, economic policies, all of these things, interaction with the global market, they all play a very critical role. For instance, the Gulf states with their wells from oil and gas reserve exhibit different socioeconomic structure compared to agricultural societies in parts of Africa or parts of Asia or places like Afghanistan, all right? And we also talk about this close proximity of diverse cultures often leads to significant exchange and adaptation. And you can look at the example of European Muslim communities in the Balkans experience different cultural influence compared to those in Arabia. So Muslim living in close proximity alongside non-Muslims may adopt elements from this neighboring culture, right? With cultural exchange in both directions. The picture that you see, this is a Hindu family in India during the Ramadan, fasting along with the Muslims. All right, they maintain their religion. They have not converted, but they're fasting and they're breaking fast, because they're living very close to each other. So this is evident, in the Indian subcontinent. Now, historical journey also of Islam in different regions has shaped the attitudes and practices of their Muslim population. I've given you this historical experience of Ottomans and Omanis, all right, but if you look at the modern challenges of globalization, secularism, liberalism, geopolitics, also they shape how Islam is perceived and practiced in different parts of the world. And younger Muslim generations might have different views on Islamic teachings or some parts of Islamic teaching due to their exposure to global cultures and education systems. All right. Now, if we look at how the West view Islam, and this is the whole point of bringing this topic of culture and religion, because of this misunderstanding sometimes. So Western perception of Islam and Muslim often fall into these two very misleading views. So one view, they look at it, as Muslims, they look at us in a very monolithic view. So Westerners, sometimes they see Muslim as a single homogeneous group without recognizing the cultural diversity, or even in diversity of some beliefs and practices that vary by time and location. And this is dangerous because this is what has led, to generalize Muslim in the Islamophobic, narrative. All Muslims are violent, all Muslim are this, Muslim are oppressive to women, Muslim, these kind of stereotypes, it's really come from the monolithic view, of people. Because, for example, when you talk about violence, even when you talk about oppression of women, when you read statistics of how women are assaulted in places like the US, for example, people are counting by minutes, women are assaulted, and, statistics that are unimaginable in our societies. And yet, in the West, when it happens not as a as a stereotype. It happens by, they're looking at it as a exceptional, maybe someone who is crazy, someone, has some psychological issues, has someone, same thing with violence. We see people, going into a public space and just, open fire on innocent people and kill, and then when he's caught, or or when it is reported in the media, it is reported as an exceptional case. It's not, they don't put the religion of that person, or they don't identify the person with their religion as a Muslim terrorist or Muslim extremist, or the way they describe to us. I have never heard about a Christian extremist or Christian terrorist or Christian, So these are the wrong view, all right. And another view is a fragmented view. So Islam is sometimes seen as overly fragmented or characterized mainly by regional or sectarian divisions, such as a Turkish Islam, or Salafi Islam, or Sunni Islam, or Ibadi Islam, rather than by its core universal teaching and scriptures. And it can be even experts, people who are educated, they do it, they unconsciously doing this. So the picture that you see here, this lady is an expert in Ibadism, and this is a famous book she wrote. I think she even visited Oman, I think, when she did her thesis. But look at the title, The Essentials of Ibadi Islam, as if Ibadi can be described independently as a version of Islam, rather than as a school of jurisprudence. So the correct perspective, of course, is that while Islam is a unified in basic faith and practice, the Muslim societies are culturally diverse. So unity in Islam means Islam is unified in its core beliefs and practice. So all Muslims will share the same, basic faith and practices, but we have this cultural diversity among Muslims. So despite this religious unity, Muslims exhibit this rich cultural diversity, which reflect in varying practices, whether clothing, cuisine, language, and all sort of things. So I've developed this way of viewing, and these issues of diversity and issues of kind of a way to solve the problem that I see with the West, the way they view us. You have universal teachings of Islam, which is the scriptures, which we all follow, the Quran and the prophetic teachings, but you'd also have the local condition, and this is a cultural context. So, for example, when you look at Oman, all right, this idea of tasamuh or ta'ayush and all of this, these are very cultural contexts. And at the top, you can look at that, the madahib, but I'm not talking only madahib. I'm talking about even cultural elements, because the Muslim world is divided according to madahib, yes, but I'm talking about general, about the cultural context. And it also depends for a person to bring Islam into their lives. They depend on the knowledge, how much they know about Islam, how much they understand, and how they commit, the commitment, because you could be knowledgeable, but you are not committed to the values and the practice. And I call this internalization. So you need these three elements, and therefore every individual and every society, every Muslim and every Muslim society we have unique experience of Islam depending on these elements. So even in this group where, I'm addressing now, we have maybe 20 plus individuals here. Each one of us has unique experience of Islam because it also reflects your knowledge of Islam, your understanding of Islam, and how you commit yourself to Islam. Okay. One person may hear adhan and wait and say, until last minute we'll go, or maybe I'll pray later. And another person hear adhan, rush to the mosque, and he's there on the first line. So it's all this internalization, it makes uniqueness. So quickly on good and bad cultures. In the context of Islam, the differentiation between what is good culture and what is bad culture, it hinges on how well these practices align with Islamic teachings and principles. This is you can say the standard, So here is an exploration of some cultural practices that are generally viewed favorably with the Islamic framework. These are good cultures, as those that are condemned or bad cultures. So, for example, hospitality, really this is a good culture. It does reflect the prophetic tradition, and I could have quoted some hadith, many hadith on the area of hospitality, respect for elders, close family ties, silat al-arham. It has been emphasized in the Quran, after faith, if you break close family ties, it's like you are disbelieving. And charity, community service, all of these things are good culture that are nurtured in the Islam. Cleanliness and hygiene. This is very interesting because cleanliness and personal hygiene has always been part of Muslim cultures, as the hadith reflects, al-nadafa min al-iman. So Muslims are required to follow all these regular purification baths, toilet etiquette, ablution, and these sometimes appear to be unique to Islam and Muslims, yeah? And Muslim from early on, they started, using toothbrush, toothpaste. They're the one who invent soaps, the use of perfumes, the use of frankincense, use all of this to keep themselves clean and fresh. We have contributed quite a lot to the Western civilization in this area because Europe in the Middle Ages didn't have this. It was very dirty, smelly, and Muslims have contributed quite a lot in this area. And when it comes to bad culture, some of these bad cultures, they have remained, even though Islam has fought hard, to get rid of these bad cultures, but in some in Muslim societies have remained, and unfortunately, they are wrongly attributed to Islam, even though Islam is against. So like forced marriage or child marriage, female genital mutilation, or what they call FGM, honor killings, all these things, Islam strictly prohibits violence. And therefore, there's nothing honor in killing, because the life, the sanctity of life is really emphasized in Islam. Extremist behavior, Islam denounces all form of extremism leading to violence. Islam always advocates moderation, all right? Tribalism and racism, Islam advocate for unity, ummah, and equality across all races. The people who are around the Prophet, they were people of different, different background. Unlike what we read about in Christianity about the Hawarijin, or the people around Sayyidina Isa, You know, they were all people of the same culture, as opposed in people around the Prophet, they were people of different cultures. Yeah. And the Prophet emphasized in his last sermon, no white is superior to black, or no black is superior to white, except by piety. And therefore, in Islam is very, you know, this idea of quality and all is kind of emphasized. Excessive consumption in West, Islam emphasized, of course, on hospitality and encourage people to be generous, especially to guests and within the community. But this value is also balanced by a very strong condemnation or prohibition against excess and wastefulness. And there are many, you know, verses and hadith that speak about, you know, waste and excessive consumption, especially related to food and drinks. Yeah.
يا بني آدم خذوا زينتكم عند كل مسجد وكلوا واشربوا ولا تسرفوا إنه لا يحب المسرفين إن المبذرين كانوا إخوان الشياطين وكان الشيطان لربه كفورا.
This is very strong verse because the people who West have been equated to the brothers of shayateen. So it can be get more serious than that. But unfortunately, the practice of excessive consumption and waste has become very prevalent in many Muslim communities, especially food waste. And you know, unfortunately, also during festivals or special occasion, you know, like Eid, Ramadan, marriage feast, we see a lot of that. Okay, so we have 10 minutes and we can cover the last part, cultural. We're looking at the cultural challenges that are facing Muslim in the West. So the Muslim population in Europe has grown, you know, over the last decades. And there are many reasons. We have these historical colonial ties. We have economic migration. People went to find jobs. We have a lot of religious conversion. People, you know, coming to Islam. And more recently, we have these political refugees because of these wars post 9/11. So this marks the first time in Islamic history where large Muslim communities are actually living as minorities in predominantly non-Muslim lands. So many Europeans, they view Islam and Muslim as a long-term threat to European identity. So again, this is a cultural issue, you know, European identity and liberal values and liberal lifestyle, you know, especially after the events of 9/11, which is also framed, you know, European Muslim as being security risk. So in the post 9/11 era, perception of Islam and Muslim within Europe, it vary and is very complex. Many Europeans, they view the growing Muslim presence as a challenge to traditional European identity, and of course, and the liberal, you know, lifestyle, secular lifestyle, but often seeing Muslims' presence through the lens of cultural and security threat. So this viewpoint has been further complicated by high profile, you know, this violence that takes place, like terrorist attacks and things like that. And usually, you know, Muslims, they have seen with a suspicious eye. Political reaction to Muslim presence in Europe also vary, but include those who argue that Muslims have not adequately integrated into European society. So you have politicians who critique multicultural policies, and they advocate now very strict migration control as a solution to what they perceive as a failure of integration. So other politicians, they place blame on Muslim population for broader socioeconomic problems, things like unemployment, strain on welfare system, all they put a blame on the Muslim. And these dynamics illustrate a complex interplay, of migration, religion, identity, and politics within Europe. And this is what is shaping the public discourse and policy regarding the continent's Muslim residents and citizens. Now, the rise of Islamophobia and far-right political parties in the West is also linked to the increasing Muslim populations in these regions. And these parties, which often express anti-Islam and anti-Muslim sentiments, have gained, popularity, traction, and even won seats in the European Union parliaments. You have, this guy who has won election recently, and maybe he would become the Prime Minister of Holland. Very anti-Islam, very anti-Muslim. I don't have time to run the video, so I'll just skip that. I think you can find that on YouTube. So cultural isolation often stems from a desire to preserve one's distinct cultural and religious identity. And so you have some Muslim living in Europe who kind of opt for cultural isolation. They're kind of living in Europe, out of Europe. They are in Europe, but they live out of Europe because they want to maintain fully their distinct cultural and religious identity. Because of this discrimination from the host society, this situation can result in these communities maintaining strong ties to their native customs, but they will interact minimally with the broader societal fabric. And it's not sustainable. This preservation of culture and identity provide a sense of belonging, but it does limit, the other aspect of life for these Muslims in Europe. And you have another, extreme, which is the cultural assimilation. So discussions on multiculturalism and religious pluralism inevitably focus on how to integrate or how to assimilate immigrants to to foster social cohesion, ensuring this peaceful coexistence. But in the West, the approach to manage ethnic and religious diversity, it varies with the political landscape. So you have this melting pot strategy of cultural assimilation. And this is always, it is favored by the right wing and the far right parties who seek to assimilate minorities into the host culture completely. So potentially they want to erase their ethnic and religious identities, as opposed to cultural integration. And they call this salad bowl strategy of cultural integration, and this is typically supported by left-wing and centrist political parties, actively promotes the integration of minorities rather than their assimilation. So this inclusive approach, at least it allows minority to maintain and express their unique cultural and religious identities, and is celebrating the diversity within the societal fabric. At the same time, it ensures that these groups have equal opportunities to participate in all sphere of life. So this is kind of summarizing. So you have isolation. So you maintain, they maintain their own cultural ways and close to the wider host society. So these are like Muslims in Europe living out of Europe. And the integration, this is the best option, where Muslims who keep their Islam and the Islamic values and Islamic culture, yet they positively receive from and contribute they also contribute. It's not just what they receive to the, you know, from the Western value, but to also contribute to the Western values. And you know, they kind of take a unique identity, you know, like European Muslims. And then you have this assimilation where people are assimilated, these are non-practicing Muslims who have lost their Islam and even some of the Islamic culture and Islamic values. So these are like Muslims without Islam. The migration process itself is complex. It's not easy, regardless of ethnicity and religion. You know, you go to steps, it can take a generation, you know, depending when you arrive, you know, the thing that you are struggling with, you know, to realize your permanence until when you are able to open up to the wider society, and when you can build a new identity, and then you can start contributing to the world around you. So there is economic integration. This is the initial stage, you know, for immigrant survival. And then you have social and artistic integration. And this phase including building relationships through learning the language and culture of the host country. And then the final stage involve creating a unique identity that merges the best aspects of where you come from and the best aspect of your, you know, of your host country. So the term integration is always ambiguous when they talk about integration. You know, if you read this in the media or if you hear from the politicians, it all depends on what is the intentions and what is the expectation. So sometimes they say integration, but what they mean is actually assimilation. They want to assimilate. They want people to sacrifice their identity, their cultural values. So Western perceptions tend to view immigrants as having no cultural or religious background. They want them just to adapt to, you know. So true religious freedom, it must allow individuals to live according to the core value of their faith, you know, supporting this tolerance and peaceful coexistence in a pluralistic society. And this is a key reason why some Muslims may resist the calls for integration. I think we have reached to the time. I've got